Isn't that your poor, wretched ex-wife, Maya? What's she doing here?
Oh, God.
You look absolutely breathtaking tonight.
Oh, you're too sweet. And you look incredibly handsome.
I'm so lucky to have you.
My ex-husband thought divorce had already ruined my life, until my billionaire husband called me his wife. And here's exactly how it happened. Exactly 12 months prior, Marcus and I were sitting in a completely different world. It was a gray, miserable Tuesday afternoon. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was brutal, whipping rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Azure Room, one of downtown Chicago's most exclusive, overpriced restaurants. I had taken the L train to get there, my umbrella turning inside out twice, leaving the hem of my gray slacks soaked and my favorite beige cardigan damp and smelling faintly of wet wool. Marcus was already seated at a corner booth when I arrived. He looked pristine, completely untouched by the city's weather. At 33, he had just been promoted to vice president of acquisitions at Horizon Tech, a massive software conglomerate. He was wearing a slate gray suit that hugged his broad shoulders perfectly, and that damn Rolex Submariner he had bought to celebrate his promotion was gleaming on his wrist. I slid into the booth across from him, shivering slightly, trying to discreetly wring out the sleeves of my cardigan under the table. "I'm so sorry I'm late, baby," I said, offering a tired but genuine smile. The red line was delayed and the rain is just unbelievable out there. Marcus didn't smile back. He didn't reach across the table to take my hand, nor did he ask if I was cold. He was staring at me with a look of clinical detachment, the way an auditor looks at a failing spreadsheet. "You're dripping on the leather, Maya," he said coldly. I blinked, pulling my arms closer to my chest. "Oh, sorry." I grabbed a linen napkin and nervously dabbed at my damp sleeves. "So what's the occasion? Allie, you usually don't want to do lunch during the week unless it's a big client. Did you close the Patterson deal?" Marcus picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with deliberate precision. "There is no occasion, Maya. I asked you here because we need to have a practical conversation about our future, or rather, the lack thereof." My stomach plummeted. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, the soft jazz playing overhead, the low hum of wealthy patrons seemed to drop away, leaving a ringing silence in my ears. "What are you talking about, Marcus?" He reached into his tailored inner pocket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He slid it across the polished mahogany table. It stopped inches from my damp hands. "I'm filing for divorce," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was a business transaction. "The papers are all there. My lawyer has already drafted the settlement. It's generous, considering the circumstances. You'll get enough to cover a few months' rent while you figure out your situation." I stared at the envelope, my mind struggling to process the words. "Divorce? Marcus, we've been married for 7 years. We've been together since undergrad. What do you mean, divorce?" He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as if I were a child asking a tedious question. "Maya, please don't make a scene. Look at us. Just look at us." He gestured between his impeccable suit and my frayed, wet cardigan. "We are moving in completely different directions. I'm a vice president at Horizon. I am managing million-dollar portfolios. I attend galas, networking events, high-stakes dinners. And you." He trailed off, his eyes scanning my face with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You're a public librarian, Maya. You bring home $40,000 a year. Or you refuse to network. You don't fit into my world anymore." "I supported you." My voice cracked, a sudden surge of heat flooding my chest. "When you failed your finals, I stayed up all night tutoring you. When you got fired from your first firm, I worked double shifts at the library and took in freelance editing just so we wouldn't lose our apartment. I built you, Marcus." "You didn't build me," he sneered, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I built myself. You were a comfortable placeholder, a starter wife. But I'm in the big leagues now, Maya. I can't be dragging a Honda Civic behind me when I'm trying to drive a Ferrari. You're dead weight. You're holding me back." The words felt like a physical blow to my ribs. Dead weight. A starter wife. 7 years of loyalty, of rubbing his shoulders when he was stressed, of celebrating his tiny victories, of loving him when he was absolutely nothing, reduced to a bad investment. He was eager to write off. "Is there someone else?" I asked, the question tasting like ash in my mouth. Marcus smirked, leaning back in the booth. "That's irrelevant, but if you must know, yes. Chloe from marketing. She understands the game, Maya. She knows how to dress, how to act, how to elevate a man's status. She's an asset. You're a liability." I didn't cry. The pain was too deep, too absolute for tears. I looked at the man I had loved, realizing that the Marcus I knew had died a long time ago, replaced by this hollow, status-obsessed stranger. I slowly pushed the manila envelope back across the table. "I won't fight you, Marcus. If you want to leave, leave. But don't you dare think you're upgrading. You're throwing away someone who loved your soul for someone who only loves your title." Marcus laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "Spare me the poetry, Maya. Sign the papers by Friday. I want you out of the apartment by the end of the month." He stood up, tossing a $100 bill onto the table to cover his sparkling water. He didn't look back as he walked out of the restaurant, leaving me sitting alone in my wet clothes, the envelope sitting between us like a tombstone. For the next 14 months, I thought I was buried. I thought divorce had ruined my life. I moved into a tiny, drafty apartment on the south side. I threw myself into my work at the library, finding solace in the quiet aisles, surrounding myself with the dusty smell of old paper and the silent companionship of thousands of books. I disappeared from the world. I became a ghost. But ghosts have a way of coming back to haunt the people who killed them. And as I stood in the Waldorf Astoria, feeling the warmth of Elias Sterling's hand wrapped tightly around mine, listening to the absolute silence of a room full of powerful people staring at me in awe, I looked at Marcus's pale, terrified face. My ex-husband thought he had buried me. He didn't realize I was a seed. And the rain he left me out in? It was exactly what I needed to grow into, something he could never afford to touch. The sound of Marcus's shattering champagne flute echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous, vaulted ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. For a fraction of a second, the world stood entirely still. No one moved, no one breathed. The titans of industry, the hedge fund managers, the tech innovators, all of them were frozen, their eyes darting between the broken crystal at Marcus's feet and the breathtaking reality of Elias holding my hand at the base of the marble staircase. I watched the color completely drain from Marcus's face, leaving his rich, dark complexion looking ashen and hollow. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for the devastating pull of gravity. Beside him, Chloe was vibrating with a frantic, nervous energy. Her crimson silk gown, which had seemed so bold and commanding just moments before, now looked garish, almost desperate against the elegant, moody atmosphere of the room. She tugged fiercely at Marcus's tuxedo sleeve, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric. I could read her lips as she hissed his name, her face flushed with the embarrassment of being tethered to the only man in the room making a scene. But Marcus was paralyzed. His eyes, wide and filled with a frantic, scrambling terror, were locked onto mine. Elias didn't even flinch at the sound of the breaking glass. He merely tightened his warm, reassuring grip on my hand and guided me smoothly off the final marble step. He leaned in close, his voice a low, soothing rumble meant only for my ears. "Are you all right, my love?" "I've never been better," I whispered back, and it was the truest thing I had ever spoken. We began our slow descent into the crowd, walking toward the head table. The sea of the American elite parted for us instinctively. As we moved, the soft, cinematic lighting of the ballroom, a warm, golden wash that contrasted perfectly with the deep, moody teal shadows cast by the heavy velvet drapery, caught the facets of the sterling star diamond resting against my collarbone. It sent fractured beams of light dancing across the room, a dazzling, undeniable physical manifestation of my new reality. People murmured as we passed. The whispers were a chaotic symphony of awe, confusion, and raw curiosity. I heard fragments of sentences floating through the air. "Who is she? I thought he was married to his work. Look at how he looks at her. That's the vice president of Horizon over there who dropped his glass, isn't it? We reached the head table, a sprawling expanse of mahogany adorned with cascading white orchids and flickering, tall taper candles. Elias pulled out my chair himself, brushing a stray curl from my shoulder before taking his seat beside me. Before the first course could even be served, the gravity I had anticipated finally took hold of Marcus. Protocol at these high-level corporate galas is strict. You do not approach the head table, you do not corner the host, and you certainly do not aggressively push past a row of private security to get to Elias Sterling. But desperation is a powerful, blinding force. I saw him coming out of the corner of my eye. Marcus had shaken off Chloe. She was standing near the ice sculpture, her arms crossed, looking furious and humiliated, and was marching toward our table. His steps were heavy, his posture stiff. A sharply dressed security guard, a towering, broad-shouldered black man with an earpiece, instantly stepped into Marcus's path, placing a firm, unyielding hand against Marcus's chest. "Sir, you need to return to your table," the guard stated, his voice low but carrying a distinct, dangerous edge. "I need to speak to her," Marcus hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of panic and residual entitlement. He tried to look past the guard's massive shoulder, his eyes locking onto me. Maya, tell him to let me through. We need to talk, now." Elias slowly placed his linen napkin on the table. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head and looked at Marcus. The temperature in our immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elias's eyes, usually so warm and tender when they looked at me, were now flat, cold, and utterly terrifying. "Let him speak, David," Elias said softly to the guard. The guard dropped his hand but didn't move an inch from Marcus's personal space. Marcus adjusted his tuxedo jacket, trying and completely failing to muster the arrogant, domineering aura he used to wield over me in our tiny Chicago apartment. He looked from Elias to me, swallowing hard. "Maya?" Marcus started, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it lower, trying to sound authoritative. "What is this? What kind of game are you playing? You disappear for over a year. You don't answer your emails and now you show up here? With Mr. Sterling?" I looked up at him from my seat. I didn't feel the familiar, suffocating knot of anxiety that used to grip my chest whenever Marcus raised his voice or demanded an explanation. I felt nothing but a cool, serene detachment. He looked so incredibly small. "It's not a game, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, smooth, and perfectly modulated. "And I didn't disappear. I just stopped existing in your world. As for why I'm here, I believe my husband already made that quite clear during his introduction." Marcus visibly flinched at the word husband. He gripped the back of an empty chair nearby, his knuckles turning slightly pale. "Husband, you expect me to believe that you, a public librarian who couldn't even afford to dry clean a decent dress, just happened to marry a billionaire? You set this up. You did this to humiliate me in front of the board." Before I could respond, Elias chuckled. It was a dark, humorless sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Mr. Harper, isn't it?" Elias asked, leaning back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. "Vice President of Acquisitions at Horizon Tech. I read your brief last week regarding the proposed merger with Sterling Global's logistics division." Marcus's eyes widened, a sudden, desperate hope flaring in his chest. The merger. It was the white whale of his career. If he landed that deal, he would make partner before he turned 35. "Yes, sir," Marcus stammered, his tone instantly shifting from aggressive ex-husband to sycophantic middle management. "Yes, I spearheaded that proposal. I believe there are incredible synergies between our two frameworks, and I'd love the opportunity to walk you through the projections." "I shredded the proposal, Marcus," Elias interrupted, his voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. The hope died in Marcus's eyes instantly. "Sir, I don't understand. The numbers are solid. The board at Horizon." "I don't care about the numbers," Elias said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. The terrifying, quiet intensity of his gaze pinned Marcus to the spot. "I care about judgment. I care about character. When I evaluate a company, I evaluate the men running it. I look at their history, their decision-making, and their ability to recognize true value. Elias reached over and gently took my hand, lifting it to press a soft kiss against my knuckles. You had the most valuable, precious asset in the world sitting across from you, Elias continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. A woman of profound depth, unshakable loyalty, and brilliant intellect. A woman who built you from the ground up when you were nothing but a struggling student with failing grades. And you discarded her because she didn't match the superficial, cheap aesthetic you thought you needed for a corporate promotion. Marcus was shaking his head slowly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. That's a personal matter. It has nothing to do with business. It has everything to do with business, Elias countered flawlessly. A man who cannot recognize a diamond when he's holding it in his bare hands is not a man I trust with my company's future. A man who throws away a foundation of solid rock to chase a fragile pane of glass is a liability. You are a liability, Mr. Harper, and Sterling Global does not partner with liabilities. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. He stumbled backward a half step, bumping into the security guard who firmly righted him. Now, Elias said, his tone final and absolute, you are upsetting my wife, and I do not tolerate anything that upsets my wife. Return to your table, Mr. Harper. Enjoy the salmon. It will be the last meal you eat in this room. Marcus didn't say another word. He couldn't. He turned, his shoulders slumped, his confident strut replaced by a hollow, defeated shuffle, and walked away. I watched him retreat, feeling a profound, sweeping sense of closure wash over me. As I sat there basking in the protective, cinematic glow of Elias's presence, my mind drifted back to the journey that had brought me to this exact seat. Marcus was right about one thing: I had been destitute. I had been broken. When he walked out of that restaurant in Chicago, leaving me with wet clothes and a divorce decree, he had taken my entire foundation with him. The months that followed were a blur of survival. I had moved out of our luxury high-rise and into a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment in a forgotten corner of the South Side. The radiators clanked all night, the windows rattled when the wind howled off the lake, and the view was a brick wall covered in peeling, faded advertisements. I lived on ramen noodles and discounted library cafe sandwiches. I wore the same 3 threadbare cardigans on rotation, burying myself in my work at the oldest public library. The library was my sanctuary. It was a massive, crumbling stone building with high ceilings, rows of ancient mahogany bookshelves, and tall, arched windows that let in a soft, diffused light. It smelled of vanilla, dust, and aging paper, a comforting, grounding scent that anchored me when the panic of my new reality threatened to pull me under. It was on a particularly brutal Thursday evening in late October, exactly 10 months ago, that the trajectory of my life changed forever. The rain was coming down in sheets, relentless and freezing. The sky outside the arched library windows was a deep, bruising purple, and the streetlights cast long, moody, teal-hued shadows across the wet pavement. It was a cinematic, almost melancholic atmosphere. The library was practically empty, save for a few regulars sleeping in the armchairs near the radiators. I was standing behind the heavy wooden circulation desk, sorting through a towering stack of returned biographies, trying to ignore the dull ache in my lower back. I was wearing my frayed beige cardigan, my hair pulled back into a messy, exhausted puff. The heavy oak front doors pushed open, letting in a gust of freezing wind and the loud rushing sound of the rain. A man stepped inside. Even from 30 feet away, he commanded the space. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked to the bone. He wore a simple, classic tan trench coat over a dark turtleneck and dark slacks. He didn't look like a billionaire. He didn't have a Rolex flashing on his wrist, and he wasn't surrounded by an entourage. He just looked like a man seeking refuge from the storm. He stood near the entrance for a moment, shaking the water from his umbrella, his dark eyes scanning the vast, quiet expanse of the reading room before locking onto the circulation desk. He walked toward me. As he got closer, I felt a strange, inexplicable pull. His face was striking. A sharp, intelligent jawline, high cheekbones, and skin the color of rich mahogany. But it was his eyes that caught me off guard. They were dark, deep, and carried a heavy, profound weariness that I instantly recognized. It was the look of someone who carried the weight of the world, someone who was surrounded by people but entirely alone. He stopped at the desk, water dripping from the silver-streaked hair at his temples onto the scarred wood. "Good evening," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that sent a startling warmth spreading through my chest. "Good evening," I replied, forcing a polite, professional smile, trying to ignore the sudden nervous fluttering in my stomach. "Miserable night out there. Can I help you find something?" "Lol?" He offered a small, self-deprecating smile. "I hope so. I'm looking for something quite specific, and unfortunately, quite out of print. I was told this branch might have an archived copy." "I know the archives like the back of my hand," I said, leaning forward slightly, my librarian instincts kicking in. "What's the title?" "The Architecture of Solitude by Julian Vance," he replied. "The 1952 edition specifically." I raised an eyebrow. It wasn't exactly a beach read. It was a dense, philosophical exploration of isolation, power, and the human condition. "That's a heavy read for a rainy Thursday," I noted, turning to type the title into the ancient, clunky desktop computer. "I find that the rain demands heavy reading," he replied smoothly. I smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. "You're in luck. We do have it. But it's in the basement archives. It's reference only, so you can't check it out, but you're welcome to read it here until we close at 9. "That would be perfect. Thank you." He paused, his eyes dropping to the small plastic name tag pinned to my cardigan. "Maya." "I'll go grab it for you," I said. "Why don't you find a seat near the radiators in the back?" It's the warmest spot in the building, and the lighting is much better for reading. I spent 10 minutes in the dusty, dimly lit basement, tracking down the fragile, leather-bound volume. When I emerged, I found him sitting exactly where I had suggested. He had taken off his wet trench coat, revealing the fitted black turtleneck that accentuated his broad chest and strong arms. He was staring out the window at the rain-slicked streets, lost in a profound, heavy thought. I walked over, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet, and gently placed the book on the table. Here you go, the 1952 edition as requested." He snapped out of his reverie, looking up at me with a startling intensity. "Thank you, Maya. I appreciate the effort." "It's my job," I said softly, turning to walk away. "Wait," he called out gently. I stopped and looked back. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "You look exhausted, and the library is empty. Would you care to sit for a moment? I find myself in dire need of conversation that doesn't involve quarterly projections or market analysis." It was highly unprofessional. I had a stack of books to shelve and a desk to man. But there was something so magnetic, so genuinely requesting in his tone that I found myself pulling out the chair and sitting down. "Quarterly projections?" I asked, tilting my head. "What exactly do you do?" "I manage investments," he said vaguely, waving a hand as if to dismiss the topic entirely. "It's tedious. I'd much rather talk about why a librarian in Chicago knows exactly where to find an obscure 1952 philosophical text on isolation." And so we talked. We didn't talk about status or wealth or cars or bespoke suits. We talked about literature, about the history of the city, about the hidden beauty in broken things. We talked for an hour, the rain battering the windows, surrounded by the warm, cinematic glow of the vintage brass reading lamps. He didn't look at my frayed cardigan. He didn't look at me like I was a liability. He looked at me like I was the most fascinating book he had ever opened. When the library's closing bell finally rang, jarring us both out of our deep conversation, he stood up reluctantly. He put his wet trench coat back on and picked up his umbrella. "I didn't get your name," I realized suddenly, standing up with him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a shadow crossing his eyes before he smiled. "Elias. My name is Elias." "Well, Elias," I said, clutching the Julian Vance book to my chest. "It was nice to meet you. If you need more heavy reading, you know where to find me." He stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering certainty. "Oh, I will be back, Maya. You can count on it." And he was. He came back the next day and the day after that. He became the only constant in a world that had entirely abandoned me. I didn't know he was a billionaire. I didn't know he owned half the real estate in downtown Chicago. I only knew that he brought me coffee on cold mornings, listened to my thoughts as if they were gospel, and looked at me as if I wore a crown of diamonds long before he ever placed one around my neck. Marcus had demanded perfection, demanding a polished, superficial asset to match his fragile ego. But Elias? Elias had found me in the ruins, bleeding and discarded, and he had helped me build an empire. Sitting at the head table at the Waldorf Astoria, watching the elite scramble for Elias's attention, I took a slow sip of my water. I glanced over to where Marcus was now sitting at a table near the back, his head in his hands, completely ignored by Chloe and his peers. The rain in Chicago hadn't washed me away. It had watered the roots of something Marcus could never have survived. And as Elias reached over to squeeze my hand once more, I knew the story of my ruin was actually the very first chapter of my reign. The morning after the gala, I woke up to a world that felt fundamentally rearranged. I opened my eyes to the soft, diffused morning sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elias's Manhattan penthouse. The bedroom was a masterpiece of modern cinematic design. It felt like walking onto a set perfectly calibrated for high-end studio lighting. The walls were painted a deep, moody teal that shifted in color as the sun moved across the sky, creating a rich, immersive backdrop that contrasted sharply with the sleek, brushed gold fixtures and the expansive white marble floors. Elias was already awake. He was standing by the window, already dressed in a tailored charcoal slate suit, sipping from a porcelain coffee cup while looking out over the sprawling concrete empire of New York City. The silver at his temples caught the morning light, and even in the quiet stillness of our bedroom, he exuded a heavy gravitational pull of authority. He turned when he heard the silk sheets rustle, his sharp, handsome features immediately softening. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his deep baritone rolling across the room like velvet. He walked over, placing his coffee on the nightstand, and sat on the edge of the massive king-sized bed. He reached out his warm, strong hand, gently tracing the line of my jaw before brushing my natural curls back from my face. "Good morning," I murmured, leaning into his touch. I glanced down at my left hand, where a brilliant, emerald-cut diamond rested flawlessly against my deep brown skin. It still felt surreal. Just over a year ago, I was meticulously calculating the cost of generic brand groceries, terrified of an unexpected heating bill. Now I was waking up as the matriarch of a billion-dollar dynasty. "Did you sleep well?" Elias asked, his dark eyes searching mine with that familiar, intense devotion. "I did," I admitted, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Though, I think the adrenaline from last night took a while to wear off. I keep seeing Marcus's face when that glass shattered." Elias chuckled, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. "That was merely the prelude, Maya. The overture. Today we perform the main event." I sat up, pulling the thick, luxurious duvet around my shoulders. "What do you mean?" Elias stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "I have an emergency 10 o'clock meeting at the executive offices of Horizon Tech. Their CEO, Richard Vance, has been frantically calling my private line since 6 this morning, doing damage control. He knows that his youngest vice president just insulted the wife of the man holding the keys to their most lucrative acquisition in a decade." Elias turned to look at me, a dangerous, thrilling glint in his eye. "I want you there with me." "At Horizon?" I asked, my heart doing a sudden nervous flutter. "Elias, I've never stepped foot in that building. Marcus always said I wasn't polished enough to attend the corporate functions. He kept my existence entirely separate from his career." Elias's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. The thought of Marcus disrespecting me was the one thing that could instantly crack Elias's composed exterior. "Marcus Harper's career was a paper castle built on your sacrifices, Maya. Today, we burn it down. Get dressed. Wear something formidable." An hour later, we were sitting in the back of Elias's customized armored Maybach, gliding silently through the chaotic Manhattan traffic. I had chosen a tailored forest green power suit with a sharp, structured shoulder and wide leg trousers that flowed beautifully when I walked, paired with black stiletto pumps and my hair pinned into an elegant, commanding updo. I looked like a woman who owned the room before I even entered it. When we pulled up to the towering glass and steel monolith of the Horizon Tech headquarters, a team of 4 executives was already waiting on the sidewalk. They looked like terrified penguins in their dark suits, shifting nervously in the crisp autumn air. The moment Elias's security detail opened my door, the executives practically tripped over themselves to bow their heads. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling, it is an absolute honor," the lead executive stammered, his eyes darting to the massive diamond on my finger before quickly looking away. "Mr. Vance is waiting for you in the primary boardroom on the 50th floor." Elias didn't speak to them. He simply placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me through the grand glass doors of the lobby. The interior of Horizon Tech was sterile and aggressively modern, flooded with bright, cold fluorescent lighting that lacked the warm, cinematic depth of Elias's world. As we walked toward the private executive elevators, I could feel the eyes of hundreds of employees on us. Whispers followed us like a draft. The news of the gala had clearly circulated. We rode the elevator in silence, the numbers ticking up rapidly. When the doors slid open on the 50th floor, we were greeted by the sprawling, mahogany-paneled expanse of the executive suite. Richard Vance, the CEO of Horizon Tech, was standing outside the boardroom doors. He was an older black man with a stern, deeply lined face and an aura of ruthless pragmatism. He looked incredibly stressed. "Elias," Richard said, extending a hand as we approached. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I cannot express how deeply I apologize for the catastrophic lack of judgment displayed by one of my subordinates last night." Elias didn't take the offered hand. "Richard," he said coldly, "allow me to introduce my wife, Maya Sterling, the woman your vice president of acquisitions publicly degraded in an attempt to elevate a marketing assistant." Richard paled slightly, retracting his hand and offering me a deep, respectful nod. "Mrs. Sterling, the fault is entirely ours. It is an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine, Mr. Vance," I said smoothly, my voice steady and completely devoid of the intimidation I once would have felt in this environment. "Please, come inside," Richard urged, opening the heavy oak doors to the boardroom. The room was vast, dominated by a long, polished marble table. The lighting in here was dramatic, large overhead fixtures casting intense pools of light while leaving the corners of the room in deep, moody shadows. It felt like an interrogation room dressed up as a corporate suite. And sitting at the far end of the table, looking like a man awaiting the guillotine, was Marcus. Next to him sat Chloe, though she had deliberately put a solid 2 feet of distance between their chairs. She wasn't wearing her crimson silk today. She was dressed in a conservative beige suit, her hair pulled back tightly, trying desperately to blend into the background. Marcus looked terrible. The confident, immaculately groomed man who had handed me divorce papers at Les Bernardins was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his custom suit looked rumpled, and there was a frantic, terrifyingly erratic energy radiating from him. When Elias and I walked in, Marcus tried to stand, but his knees seemed to fail him and he sank back into his leather chair. Elias pulled out the chair at the head of the table for me, seating me before taking the seat directly beside me. Richard Vance remained standing, pacing slightly near the large windows overlooking the city. "Let's make this exceptionally brief, Richard," Elias began, his voice slicing through the thick, suffocating tension in the room. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Sterling Global controls the shipping, logistics, and supply chain infrastructure that Horizon Tech desperately needs to launch your new consumer hardware division. Your stock has been stagnant for 3 quarters. You need this merger. I, however, do not." "Elias, we have a mutual understanding of the financial benefits," Richard started. "I am not finished," Elias interrupted, his tone lethal. I do not do business with organizations that promote fragile, incompetent men to positions of power. I do not trust a company whose vice president of acquisitions lacks the basic, fundamental ability to assess value. Elias turned his piercing gaze down the length of the table, locking onto Marcus. Mr. Harper here believed he had outgrown his wife. He believed his title, his bespoke suits, and his leased luxury cars made him a superior asset. He failed to realize that true wealth is not performative. It is structural. Maya was his structure. When he discarded her, he proved to me that his judgment is fatally flawed. He's a man who throws away gold to chase brass. Marcus swallowed loudly, his Adam's apple bobbing. Mr. Sterling, please, my personal life. Your personal life is a direct reflection of your character, Elias snapped, his voice echoing off the marble walls. And your character's bankrupt. Elias turned back to Richard Vance. Here are my terms, Richard. If you want the Sterling merger, I require a complete restructuring of your acquisitions department. And it begins with the immediate termination of Marcus Harper. The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic 50 floors below. Marcus's mouth dropped open. He looked at Richard Vance, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. Richard, sir, you can't be serious. I brought in the Patterson account. I've increased our portfolio by 12%. I'm your top earner in the division. Richard Vance looked at Marcus, not with pity but with a cold, calculating disgust. This was the reality of the corporate world Marcus had worshipped so fiercely. Loyalty didn't exist. There were only assets and liabilities, and right now Marcus was a multi-billion-dollar liability. Marcus, Richard said, his voice flat and emotionless. You have compromised the most critical strategic partnership in this company's history over an arrogant, personal vendetta. You are a liability to Horizon Tech. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal effects, and you will vacate the premises within the hour. No, Marcus stammered, panic finally breaking through his shock. He stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. It crashed against the floor, but he ignored it. He looked at me, his eyes wild, his chest heaving. Maya, please, you can't let him do this to me. This is my life. I worked for 10 years for this title. You know how hard I worked. I sat perfectly still, looking at the man I had once loved with every fiber of my being. I looked at the man who had let me walk out into the freezing Chicago rain, who had called me deadweight, who had replaced me with a younger, flashier model because he thought I dragged down his aesthetic. I know exactly how hard we worked, Marcus, I said softly, the acoustics of the room carrying my voice perfectly. I typed your college papers. I managed our budget so you could buy your first tailored suit. I swallowed my pride so you could build yours. I was the foundation you stood on. And the moment you got high enough, you kicked the foundation out from under yourself. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the cool marble table. You told me you couldn't drag a Honda Civic behind you when you were driving a Ferrari. Well, Marcus, it looks like you just crashed. Marcus let out a ragged, choked sound, stepping toward the table, but Elias's private security detail, who had been standing silently by the door, immediately moved into the room, flanking Marcus on both sides. Get your hands off me, Marcus yelled, his composure completely shattered. He looked frantically at Chloe, who was still sitting in her chair, staring straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with him. Chloe, tell Vance about the offshore accounts we secured. Tell him I'm indispensable. Chloe slowly turned her head, her face an emotionless mask. She looked at Marcus, then looked at Richard Vance, and finally looked at Elias. She understood the power dynamics in the room better than Marcus ever did. She knew exactly which way the wind was blowing, and she was already adjusting her sails. I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus, Chloe said, her voice icy and detached. Your professional conduct has been increasingly erratic. I've actually been meaning to speak to HR about a transfer out of your department. Marcus froze, the ultimate betrayal hitting him square in the chest. He stared at the woman he had destroyed our marriage for, the asset he believed would elevate him. She was cutting him loose the exact same way he had cut me loose. The poetic justice of it was almost heavy enough to crush him. "You," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "You're leaving me?" "I am protecting my career," Chloe stated coldly, standing up, smoothing her beige skirt and walking out of the boardroom without looking back. Marcus stood alone, flanked by security, stripped of his title, abandoned by his mistress, and utterly humiliated in front of the CEO he had idolized. He looked at me one last time, tears of pure, unadulterated frustration and regret spilling over his cheeks. He wasn't crying because he lost me. He was crying because he had lost his power, and he finally realized that I was the one holding the pen that signed his death warrant. "Take him out," Richard Vance ordered. The security guards grabbed Marcus by the arms, dragging him backward as he stared at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure agony, until the heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut, sealing his fate. Elias didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply reached over, picked up the new merger contracts Richard Vance had placed on the table, and pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. "We will review the restructuring of the acquisitions department by Friday, Richard," Elias said, signing the document with a fluid, commanding stroke. "If the new VP meets my wife's standards, we will proceed with the funding." "Understood, Elias. Thank you," Richard said, exhaling a massive breath of relief. Elias stood up, offering his hand to me. I took it, rising gracefully from my chair. We walked out of the boardroom, leaving Richard Vance alone with the paperwork that had just cost Marcus Harper his entire life. As we stepped into the private executive elevator and the doors slid shut, separating us from the sterile, cold world of Horizon Tech, Elias pulled me gently against his chest. I buried my face in the lapel of his charcoal suit, inhaling the rich, comforting scent of sandalwood and expensive wool. "Are you okay?" he whispered, kissing the top of my head. "I am," I said, pulling back to look into his dark, profound eyes. "I really am. For a year I thought he broke me, but seeing him in there, seeing how fragile his whole world was, I realized he never had the power to break me. He just forced me to build something stronger." Elias smiled, a slow, breathtaking expression of pure love. "You were always the strongest person in the room, Maya. It just took the right lighting for the rest of the world to see it." The elevator chimed, the doors opening to the grand lobby. We walked out together, stepping past the murmuring crowds and out into the crisp, cinematic autumn air of New York City. The Maybach was waiting, its engine purring softly. Marcus had wanted a life of luxury, status, and ruthless ambition. He had sacrificed everything real to obtain it. And in the end, he was the one left out in the cold, while the woman he discarded rode away in an empire he could only ever dream of touching.